Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We will start in just a moment. All right, let's get started. We have a lot of ground to cover today. Here's our agenda. We're going to talk about the National Fund itself, provide an overview of the program from beginning to end. We're also going to walk through the program components because the National Fund is a program, not just a grant. We offer a number of things to our grantees. We'll talk about the application process itself. It's a two-step process. We want to make sure you understand what to expect if you are planning to submit an LOI. And then there will be 10 to 15 minutes for question and answer at the end. A couple of housekeeping items. One, this presentation will be recorded and posted to our website within about a week. So if someone on your team isn't able to make it today, rest assured that they can watch the recording. Two, if you have a question for our team, please submit it using the question and answer feature on your toolbar at the bottom. Three, that being said, please hold your questions until the end. Four, because we're not going to be able to answer everyone's questions today during our limited time together, we're going to select the questions that are most widely applicable to answer for everyone. If you have a question about your specific circumstances, eligibility, or project that doesn't get answered by the end of this session, feel free to reach out directly to us. We will share our contact information at the end. So let's go into the overview. The 100,000 plus historic houses of worship across America contribute significant value to their communities. Sacred places function as hubs for social service programming. They provide essential space for community gathering and organizing, and host a variety of arts programming. The National Fund exists to support congregations and their buildings, ultimately to advance the common good. The National Fund program launched in 2016 with a 7-figure grant from the Indiana-based Lilly Endowment. Last year, we're so thankful, they renewed their support with an additional $20 million grant, which is going to enable us to offer this program through 2028. We hope beyond. Since 2016, the National Fund has awarded or pledged approximately $18 million to a total of 97 congregations. Those 97 congregations represent 24 denominations across 38 states and territories. The National Fund is a program of the organization that I am a part of, Partners for Sacred Places, in collaboration with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Our organizations work closely together to administer the program on a daily, weekly, yearly basis. As a staff member of Partners, I'm going to share a word about Partners. Partners for Sacred Places is the only non-sectarian nonprofit dedicated to the sound stewardship and active community use of older sacred places. For over 30 years, we've empowered congregations to care for their buildings and share them with their respective communities. We do that through a combination of grant-funded programming and for-fee consulting. I'm joined by Jennifer Sandy today from the National Trust, and she's going to introduce herself and her organization.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you today. I'm Jennifer Sandy. I'm a Senior Director of Preservation Programs at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and we're just delighted to partner with Partners for Sacred Places on this program. For more than 70 years, the National Trust for Historic Preservation has led the movement to save America's historic places. We are a privately funded nonprofit organization, and our work is focused around 4 pillars: saving America's historic sites, telling the full American story, building stronger communities, and investing in preservation's future. And supporting the National Fund for Sacred Places helps us reach all 4 of those goals. So we'll introduce the rest of our members of our team here in a minute, but Rachel, I'll turn it back to you.
Cool, thank you. The National Fund team consists of staff members from both Partners for Sacred Places and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. On the Partners for Sacred Places side, fund participants interact with Bob Yeager, our president, Gianfranco Grande, our executive vice president, myself, Rachel Hildebrandt. I am the director of the National Fund for Sacred Places. Lily Hamilton, our grants manager, and Emily Scheidock, our senior project manager. Jennifer, do you want to go ahead and introduce your team?
Yeah, sure. So I introduced myself already, and I lead the program for the National Trust team. Also on my team are Ann Phillips, our preservation architect, Don Ellis, associate manager of the National Fund for Sacred Places, and Diana Maxwell, our senior manager of grants.
Thanks. I also want to acknowledge our advisory committee, which is comprised of talented individuals from a diversity of backgrounds and fields. Each year, the advisory committee meets in September to help us staff determine which congregations to fund. As you can imagine, that is a difficult task as each year we receive in the ballpark of 350 to 400 LOIs, and ultimately we choose between 12 and 15, sometimes more, congregations to fund. This is just a continuation of that list. All right, let's walk through the components of the program. The National Fund is a program, not a grant. I'll say that again and again because it's really important. In addition to the capital grant, our participants receive training, technical assistance, and a planning grant of up to $10,000. Ultimately, we want to ensure that our grantees are successful in completing the project that we're funding, but also leave our program with new and expanded capacity to take on future capital work. The National Fund is not a typical grant program in that you don't get all of the money up front. In order to access our capital grant, you have to meet key architectural planning and fundraising benchmarks. Those benchmarks are, you've got to raise 1/4 of the match, either in hand or pledged is okay. And you've got to produce construction-ready drawings and specifications describing the National Fund scope of work. So please keep that in mind as I walk you through this timeline. This year, we're going to notify applicants in early October, so you'll know whether you're being funded or not in early October. Then we're going to publish a press release announcing the new cohort in mid-October. Training will then take place in November. After the training, we'll begin quarterly check-ins. We do those one-on-one with the congregations. So National Fund staff, congregational leadership meet every 3 months to check in on the progress of their projects. The first check-ins for the cohort that we accept into the program this year will happen later this year in December, but the majority will happen in January of 2025. Most congregations will spend about 1 year working toward the architectural planning and fundraising benchmarks that I described. During that year, we provide a planning grant and technical assistance. Why a year? You may be wondering. It sounds like a long time. The reason is those fundraising and project planning benchmarks. So planning activities are taking place during the first year. That means conditions assessments are happening, schematic design may be happening, and the preparation of construction documents are happening. Fundraising too, of course. Once the grantees have met those benchmarks, they complete an online application that we, the National Fund staff, review. Our review process takes about 1 month to complete. Construction on the project we're funding, which we call the National Fund scope of work, cannot begin until we've reviewed and approved that application or submission. We do this to ensure that the work we're funding meets high preservation standards. Once we've approved it, though, construction can begin. At that point, we disperse the first half of the grant. Then we disperse the second half once construction has wrapped. So essentially, the first half of the grant is upfront once you've reached that point of really being ready to start construction, and the second half is a reimbursement. So you've got to plan for that in terms of your cash flow. Our soft target for construction is 1 year, but we're flexible on that because we understand that sometimes things come up. Weather, labor shortages, things like that affect many of our grantees. So we set a target of 1 year for construction, but we work with you on your individualized timeline, just depending on your circumstances. In total, it's about a 2-year process. So now that we've discussed the timeline and where the various components of the program take place, Let's talk about each of the components individually. Training. Grantees are required to send a team of 2 to 3 leaders, including clergy, to an intensive 2-day training. We cover the following topics at the training: capital project planning, making your case for support, community-wide fundraising, friends group and supporting organizations, and we also provide an overview again of the National Fund, because most congregations do need a refresher by that point. I personally really enjoy the training, and we hear year after year from the congregations that they do too. Each and every cohort includes congregations from different faith traditions, geographies, and backgrounds, and also congregations that have varying levels of experience with capital project planning and fundraising. So the training, as such, is a great opportunity for congregations to get to know one another and learn from one another. Things to know. The training is mandatory. It takes place in November in Philadelphia, in person, of course. And we cover the cost of participating, meaning we organize lodging for everyone, and then we reimburse for travel and meals up to $1,500 per congregation. Technical assistance. Each of our grantees is eligible to receive a technical assistance package that's tailored to its needs and circumstances. The technical assistance offerings, which are bulleted out here on this slide, are intended to help our participants advance their National Fund projects. They are capital campaign support, communication support, economic halo effect study, and community engagement. I'm not going to explain each of those in detail just because we don't have a lot of time today. The key things to know about our technical assistance are each congregation is asked to choose one of these services. The services are delivered by experienced Partners for Sacred Places staff. It's totally pro bono. We don't charge for this at all. And congregations, grantees, have about 15 months to take advantage of these offerings. That's because they're intended to help you advance the planning of your project. Planning grant. Planning grants are intended to help offset the costs of project planning. We make planning grants of up to $10,000 that can be used to pay for conditions assessments or architectural design services, capital campaign consulting services such as feasibility studies and capital campaign management, and the creation of marketing materials, including video. Printed collateral counts too under that bullet point, although we find that congregations are more interested in video these days. No match is required for this. And I also want to mention while we're on this slide that some know that Partners for Sacred Places offers capital campaign consulting services, including feasibility studies and capital campaign management. Planning grants through the National Fund cannot be used to pay for Partners services. And then, of course, the capital grant. Our grants range from $50,000 to $500,000. It's also a matching grant. So grants of $175,000 and under require a 1-to-1 match, and grants above that amount of $175,000 require a 2-to-1 match. This type of requirement is very common, and it's there to ensure that our money is used to leverage additional new money. We want our grant to be catalytic, and for you all, if you receive the grant, to make the most of being part of this super competitive, nationally known program. So let me provide a couple of examples about the match. If we give a congregation a $100,000 grant, they must raise $100,000 in match. If we give a congregation a $200,000 grant, they must raise a $400,000 match. So in your LOI, if you submit an LOI, you will be asked to determine how much you want to ask us for. Think about this when you're crafting your ask to us. Make sure that there is room for the grant plus the match in your project budget. So for example, if you have a project totaling $500,000 in expenses, it probably doesn't make sense to ask us for a $250,000 grant, because A $250,000 grant requires a $500,000 match. The grant plus the match in that case is $750,000, and of course, 750 is more than the total cost of the project. So give this some thought when you're working on your LOI. Think about what amount of money it makes sense to ask for, and make sure there is enough room for the grant and the match. Lastly, but probably most importantly, I want you all to know that the majority of our grants will be $250,000 or less. We will make one or two larger grants, most likely, but we have very limited ability to make grants larger than $250,000. All of the following can count toward your match: congregational giving, fundraising events such as ticketed events, raffles, concerts, anything you can imagine or create or already do. If you're earmarking funds for match, that can count. Cash or documented pledges from individuals, foundations, or corporations. Proceeds from the sale of stock or real estate gifted to match. Matured bequests and donated materials and or professional services that directly benefit the National Fund project. In-kind donations, that last bullet point, can count for up to 20% of your match, and the value is based on what fair market value is. So we always ask the grantees that are planning to use in-kind donations as part of their match, be in touch with me to make sure that we're documenting and valuing that work properly. Ineligible matching funds. These are the things that cannot count as match. Endowment or reserve funds, including interest, bridge or construction loans, funds solicited, applied for, pledged, or secured prior to official acceptance in the program. This year, that means mid-October 2024, and other grants from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. You can raise funds before entry into the program if you have an especially large project and you want to get a jump start on fundraising, or you've already done so. Just keep in mind that those funds can't be counted towards your match. Eligible projects. Our projects fall into three categories. We fund projects that address urgent repair needs, specifically related to the envelope, projects that improve functionality or improve the accessibility of the property in accordance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, and projects that make vacant or underused space usable for community outreach. The key thing I want to point out here is that applicants should demonstrate that urgent repair needs to the building envelope have already been identified and addressed before proposing either ADA projects or interior rehabilitation projects, because we want to make sure that what we're funding reflects your building's priorities. This is a partial list of what we don't fund, what we don't pay for. Please visit our website if you'd like to look at the complete list, and we certainly encourage that if you're planning on submitting an LOI to us. We don't fund the demolition of character-defining architectural features, the purchase or lease of new property, new construction, landscaping or fencing, cemeteries, parking lots, religious art restoration, including mural restoration, pipe organ restoration or replacement, although we recognize that there's a huge need for that, pew restoration or replacement, or the purchase of AV equipment. All right, let's talk a little bit about our grant disbursement process. I think this is one of the things that makes our program most unique. So again, we're different from other grant programs in that the grant award is not dispersed at the outset. So if you are selected for participation in the fund, you're not going to get the grant shortly after you enter the program in October. Each participating congregation has to reach key benchmarks related to architectural planning and fundraising. The benchmarks are on this slide. We did talk about them already, but just to reiterate, in order to request the first half of the funds, you've got to raise a quarter of the match. Again, either in hand or pledged is fine. And you've got to produce construction-ready drawings and specifications describing every piece of the National Fund scope of work for our review. Once the capital grant documentation has been reviewed and approved by our team, then construction can begin, then the money is dispersed. I also want to emphasize that if your project includes multiple components, for example, roof and masonry or masonry and interior work, you've got to produce documentation describing each and every piece of the work for this submission. It's a one and done thing. So we can't review one thing first, a second thing second. It's all done in one go. So that's important to keep in mind for timeline planning. Reporting requirements. We require an interim report, a final report, and a final site visit. The interim report is submitted once construction is roughly 50% complete. A final report is submitted once construction is 100% complete. Then we do a final site visit. It's typically in person. We try to always have, if we can, staff from both organizations present. And it's not an inspection. Some people worry that it's an inspection. It's really not. It's about just taking a look at the work that's been done, celebrating the progress that's been made, and reflecting on the experience of being part of the National Fund. So there's sort of an evaluation of the program component to that. Once all of that is done, we disperse the second half of the grant. Please note, this is so important. Construction cannot begin on the National Fund scope of work until our team has reviewed and approved your capital grant submission. That's because we don't fund work that we haven't reviewed. All right, at this point, Ann Phillips, our team's architect, is going to go deep with you on conditions assessments. So Ann, turn it over to you.
Sure, thanks, Rachel. Hi, everybody. My name is Ann Phillips. I am the preservation architect on the team for the National Fund for Sacred Places, and I am on the National Trust for Historic Preservation side of things. Hope everybody's having a good February 1st. We're finally out of January. So I'm going to jump into the main program components of the National Fund for Sacred Places are fundraising, which Rachel just discussed at length, and then architectural planning or capital project planning, we also refer to it as. And so going back to what Rachel mentioned about eligible projects, the property must have urgent repair needs, right? We discussed that related to structural components or the envelope that are integral to building preservation and longevity. Projects that improve functionality or improve accessibility at the property in accordance with ADA, those are also eligible, as well as renovation projects. But what we really want to see in your LOI is that you've identified your urgent repair needs and that they've been addressed before you're proposing ADA or renovation projects. And so some of you may wonder, so how do you determine if your building has urgent repair needs? That is done by a building conditions assessment. So this is really your first step in the path of your capital project. What is a building conditions assessment? So it's a report that's commissioned by an architect or engineer or other specialist that assesses a building's condition, identifies issues, and presents a list of prioritized recommendations and recommendations for repair, restoration, that sort of thing. So why do you need it? It's not only a critical checkup for the historic building. As the owner of a historic building, it behooves you to actually have an up-to-date, roughly every 5 years or so, conditions assessment so that you can make informed decisions about the urgent and necessary building repairs related to your building and keep the building maintained in a proactive way rather than reactive. So for example, a conditions assessment may show the beginnings of water infiltration at the roof before it becomes a bigger issue or a much larger project, and before it causes damage to any interior renovation that you may have done before dealing with the water infiltration. It also, why do you need it? You need it to assess the building holistically. So you're looking at the building as a whole, and it's made of many parts that function together, but all of those parts need maintenance routinely. It also diagnoses the origins of any pre-existing conditions. So similar to an X-ray, that's what the image here is, an X-ray of a building. Similar to an X-ray or an MRI, it helps to diagnose interconnected issues that may not be obvious. So a leak in the sanctuary, you could assume it's from the roof, but it very well could be a leaking condensing unit or a boiler. You could just replace the roof and hope for the best, or you could have a conditions assessment where it actually identifies and figures out where that water infiltration is actually coming from. You also needed to explore repair and renovation options before the design phase. So I'll in a couple slides here walk through the typical project delivery mode for capital projects, but it really is your conditions assessment should be done before anything else, as it will determine your next steps for your project. So the question to you all is, do you have a building conditions assessment? The webinar format, I can't see any of you raising your hands, but if you don't, we highly recommend that you have one completed. As an owner of historic structure, it is best practice to have an updated document such as this to help guide your maintenance, repair, and rehabilitation decisions so that your building can be best cared for and carry your congregation into the next century. So for your purposes, it's not required for the LOI or your application necessarily, but it may make your LOI or application more competitive. Next slide, please. So then with the building's conditions assessment, you all may be wondering, well, how do we get it accomplished? How do we find the folks that we need to find to do this? We always encourage that you seek out experienced professionals. So consider professionals experienced with historic properties. Look at their websites. When you get a referral, go to their website, look at their portfolios, check the references of contractors and architects, talk to their past clients. If a referral or someone that you're considering, if on their website they don't have a category of historic preservation or historic buildings, that may be a first indicator that they may not be the right fit for your project. If they have an entire section on their website about that, about preservation and historic buildings, that is certainly a good sign. So how do you find these experienced professionals? Every state has a state historic preservation office, and they are full of resources and qualified people who will be able to connect you and offer suggestions of who may be a good fit for your building and who certainly has the qualifications and experience with historic structures. So we encourage that you reach out to your local preservation organizations. Those may be historical societies or historic district commissions. Municipal preservation offices, those often exist within the planning departments at your city, or your state historic preservation office, as I mentioned, for suggestions of where to look for those experienced professionals. And then what should you expect? What is the deliverable of, like, what are you getting? What does the conditions assessment physically look like? The format of the final product may vary depending on the architect that you select. Everybody has a different way of doing it. It typically will include photographs of detailed photographs of existing conditions, a thorough report describing the existing conditions, and a prioritized list of recommended actions, which should be used to inform your project's scope of work. If you go to the next slide, these are just a few good examples of conditions assessments where you're seeing detailed photographs, and this is very small. I apologize for the small text. Text doesn't really matter. It's just showing that it's detailed photographs with a description of the existing condition and then a recommendation of what should happen. So it can be in an 8.5 by 11 format, where it's just that sort of report style, but it could also have a report with a drawing set where they actually have elevation drawings of your building and they call out the conditions as shown on the right side, where you see an elevation of a a building with the photographs indicated. So sometimes it can be a big, 24 by 36 set of drawings that have the conditions annotated on the drawings. Sometimes it can be an 8.5 by 11 report. Sometimes it can be both. Either way, it's about in detail documenting the existing condition of your building and a prioritized list of what needs to be dealt with most urgently. Go to the next slide. So we're going to jump in now to where does the building conditions assessment fit into the larger capital planning process? As I mentioned before, it should be the absolute first thing you do. So the traditional project delivery method for capital projects is called the design, bid, build method. The design phase, as you see here, sort of highlighted, contains steps 1 and 2. During step 1, pre-design and diagnostics, you, along with qualified professionals with experience in historic properties, should be assessing the building holistically and diagnosing origins of pre-existing issues before you move into step 2, which is the architectural design phase. Step 1, this is where you will have your building conditions assessment completed. The results of that assessment are what determine the scope of your project. You then move into, once you have the scope and the map, essentially the path ahead of you, you move into step 2 of design, which is architectural design. That's when you will work with a qualified architect who has experience in historic buildings to determine the best path forward for your project. Taking the priorities identified in the building conditions assessment, the architect will work with you to determine the best solutions and craft or design an architectural solution. This is where the Secretary of the Interior standards come in. If you go to the next slide. So our program, the National Fund for Sacred Places, requires that projects that we fund adhere to the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. The Secretary of the Interior standards are a typical ubiquitous approach or framework used in the historic preservation field, including use by federal, state, and local governments. The purpose of the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties is to provide guidance to historic building owners and building managers, preservation consultants, architects, contractors, and project reviewers prior to beginning work. It is always recommended that preservation professionals be consulted early in any project. It is critical that you work with a qualified architect who not only has experience with historic properties, but also is familiar with and understands how to apply the standards to your project. There are 4 treatments for historic properties outlined by the National Park Service. I've listed them here at the top. They're preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. Each of those treatments has guidelines associated with it. We require adherence to the standards for rehabilitation, as they are the most flexible. Once you and your architect are in the architectural design phase, it is imperative that you use these standards to help develop the architectural solution. The standards should be consulted from the very beginning of the design process. And you'll see here, there are 10 of them. The content of them is not necessarily important. I just want folks to understand that there are 10 standards and that all the projects that we fund must adhere to these standards, which means that the solution your architect comes up with for your urgent building issues, they must comply with these standards. We go to the next slide, thank you. So once you've assessed your building holistically and have diagnosed the origins of any pre-existing issues through a building conditions assessment, and you've worked with your architect using the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation as a guide to develop your project scope, and they documented it through a set of construction or bid documents or drawings, it's time to put the project out to bid. So you'll see here step 3, bidding. Bidding is where you gather pricing and determine and hire the contractor who will complete the construction of the project based on the documentations generated by your architect in the design phase. And then you move on after bidding, you go to construction, which is when the contractor actually makes physical changes to your building based on the construction documents. And then step number 5 is post-construction. So that's wrapping up the details, closing the project out. This is when you'll receive certificate of substantial completion, a certificate of final completion, certificate of occupancy. All of those come from the municipality. And your contractor will also provide manuals and warranties and as-built drawings if it's included in the contract. If you go to the next slide, I want to reiterate here, as Rachel has mentioned, for the National Fund for Sacred Places, the first major milestone you'll work towards, should you be accepted, is when the first half of your grant award is dispersed. It's what we call the capital grant submission. This submission happens after you have received bids for your capital project and have selected your contractor, but before you start construction. So I just show here that in the typical path of design, bid, build, we have a milestone that is required between bidding and construction. We need to review and approve that submission. It's our review and approval of that submission that prompts the disbursement of the first half of your grant award. So to reiterate Rachel's previous slide, construction cannot begin before we approve the work. That wraps up the program components portion of the presentation. So I'll hand it off to Lily to discuss application process.
Awesome, thank you, Anne. Hey everybody, reminder, my name is Lily Hamilton. I am the grants manager for the National Fund for Sacred Places. So I'm gonna walk us through our application process for the National Fund. You can move to the next slide. Let's start with a timeline. So the National Fund is a two-step application process. Our first step is the letter of intent stage. It's not a physical letter that you mail in. It's a smaller application that you can access online. So we opened that on January 9th, and the due date for the LOI is February 29th. Notifications about whether your LOI has been approved or denied will go out on June 14th. And at that stage, the invited congregations will move into the full application round. So on June 14th, that's when our full application opens. By July 12th, that's when the application will be due. And members of the National Fund staff will work closely with each congregation at the full application stage, answering questions that you might have about the application and just assisting reviewing drafts or any kind of technical assistance that we can provide. And by mid-October, that's when we'll send out our final notifications of who has been admitted into the program. It's very important, if you can, to not reach out about the status of your LOI until after the June 14th notification date. And if you do not get an email confirmation that your LOI has been submitted, it might be important to try and add our grant administrator foundant into your contacts on your email inbox so that it doesn't go into spam. That's a common thing that happens. So if you do not hear from us by June 14th, you're safe to reach out. We can answer any questions that you might have about it. Next slide. Let's talk a little bit about basic eligibility. So in order to qualify for a National Fund grant, you need to check all of these boxes. First, you have to have been purpose-built as a house of worship. Next, your property needs to be owned and occupied by an active congregation. So this piece is very important. We fund properties and buildings that are continually used by an active congregation. So if your building has not been occupied for a long period of time, it's likely not eligible. And this might include properties that are held in trust by a denominational body, if that applies to your situation. Applicants themselves need to be a congregation or a closely affiliated nonprofit. And Rachel spoke to that a little bit earlier. That might be a friends group or a nonprofit organization that resides within the house of worship and closely works with the congregation around things related to building maintenance. If the applicant is a congregation, the congregation needs to be at least 3 years old. And finally, congregations need to demonstrate a need for project funds that exceed their typical donor base and membership. So we screen for these basic criteria first. We won't review applicants that do not meet these specific items. You can move to the next slide. Now, this is our evaluation criteria. So when we're assessing all of our LOIs and full applications, we keep in mind these 6 items, and congregations that are strong in all 6 of these items are the ones that are the most competitive and the best fit for the National Fund. Next slide. So we'll start with historic, cultural, architectural significance. We've seen this question a couple different times in the Q&A already. And just to reiterate, your building does not need to be on the national, state, or local register to qualify for the fund. However, if your building is on one of those registers and is designated or is deemed eligible to be designated, that's a really good indicator that you're going to be able to check this box. So questions you might ask yourself when trying to figure out if you meet this criteria. Does your building tell a story relevant to our history? Cultural, religious, it could be local, regional, or national. We kind of widely define that. Is the building the work of an architect? Is that architect well known? And is it a high quality of or a good example of that person's work? Is the building an exceptional example of its style or type? And does the building have a great physical presence in its community based on its location? Is it a very noticeable and well-known feature of your surrounding community? A common question that we get about this is, our church is historic or our main worship building is historic, but the main issue area that we have is related to our parish house or a rectory or some building that is adjacent to the main historic building. Will you fund a project if it's not focused on that main historic house of worship? And the answer is yes. We sometimes do fund these other buildings, and we consider them on a case-by-case basis. It's important for this other building to contribute to the significance of the main building. And we also keep in mind all of the other criteria when making that determination. If you have a specific question about your situation, you're more than welcome to reach out and we can answer it a little bit more specifically. Next slide. Community serving congregations. So we know that houses of worship serve many people beyond just their immediate congregation. They're often gathering places or de facto community centers. And we really want to support congregations that serve that purpose. So if you operate programming that serves vulnerable or at-risk populations, if you share your space with other organizations, nonprofit groups, other congregations, or even your local municipality, if you have a widespread reputation in your town or city for being a welcoming center of community life, those are all things that you should uplift in your LOI and in your application. So if you have a program where you serve meals regularly to people experiencing food insecurity, if you host musical performances, or host an AA group every now and then or regularly, please highlight that. We really want to support congregations that show their space is used outside of just their regular worship hours. Next slide. Project scope and need. So Anne and Rachel mentioned this earlier on in the presentation, and I think it's worth reiterating. You really need to make sure that you demonstrate your urgent repair needs are being addressed prior to requesting funding for improving accessibility or making vacant or underused space usable for community outreach. So these projects are definitely eligible, but if you come to us with an ADA access project but have an actively leaking roof, it'll raise a lot of questions for us as evaluators. And so, we want to make sure that our investment in your building is going the distance, that these other important building envelope concerns and other life safety and building systems concerns are being addressed prior to some of these interior rehabilitation projects. And this is just a reminder to adhere to the Secretary of the Interior standards. Next slide. So readiness, we mean a couple different things by readiness. First, understanding your building's needs. Are you ready to undergo a project planning process? Are you adequately prioritizing your building's needs when you're requesting funding from the National Fund? And are you ready to undertake the fundraising involved with the National Fund's match requirement? Can you undertake a capital campaign? Do you have a realistic fundraising goal? Prior experience, and are you good at proactively advancing projects of this nature? Keep your congregation's capacity in mind, keep your building's needs in mind. The conditions assessment can be very valuable in this way. And if you haven't started the process of planning for your capital campaign or your fundraising goals, now is a really good time to start. So you can ask yourself, have you convened a capital campaign committee? Do you have volunteers lined up who are going to take on making asks to your congregation and community? And have you considered working with a fundraising consultant? All of these questions and finding answers to them can really help make your case that you're ready to engage with the National Fund. It's an intensive and challenging process, but really rewarding and catalytic. Next slide. So healthy congregations. I just want to also emphasize here that we take context into consideration. This is not a firm checklist of items that you need to have all apply to your congregation to be considered. We try to see this holistically, but these are some measures that we take into account when assessing for congregational health. The first one being a tenured, well-respected clergy with capable lay leadership. So if you have an interim pastor or clergy of some kind, you might still have a healthy congregation. Keep that in mind here. Stable or growing membership. This is a big one. Financial strength and stability. Support of the judicatory or governing body, if that's applicable to your specific denomination or faith community. And a history of weathering challenges with resilience. I think COVID is the most frequently discussed example of a challenge that many congregations have weathered. So if you're searching for an idea, that's one thing to discuss. How has your congregation adapted to the challenges of COVID and other issues in the last couple years? And for us, that helps us know that you're prepared to move through the challenge of the National Fund. Next slide. All right, so strong applications. We really want every applicant to put their best foot forward. Try to complete every question in full and make sure you upload every required attachment. Make a compelling case for support and really tell your story. Get in touch with what makes your congregation unique, what you're passionate about when it comes to your congregation and their place in your community. Make sure to clearly articulate your project goals and components. I think this is a really big one. We don't want to walk away from an LOI not knowing what the congregation is asking us to fund. So the clearer you can be, the better. It'll make sure that we feel comfortable advancing you to the next round, the full application process. And finally, include high quality and high resolution photographs that allow us to really fully appreciate your building. This is very important. If you have not taken those high quality photos, that's a really good thing that you can do in the next couple of weeks prior to submitting the LOI. Next slide. So now that we've talked about eligibility and our evaluation criteria, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to access the LOI. So on our website, fundforsacredplaces.org, you'll see an application deadlines and process section. And over on the left, there is a button that says LOI form will be available. The buttons have been kind of disappearing from the website lately. We are working to solve that technical issue, but the link is still there. You might just need to kind of hover your cursor around it a little bit to click through to our founded website. And if you have trouble finding this link, I'm always happy to send it via email. Just reach out to me. Next slide. So once you click that button, it will take you to the National Fund login page. If you already have an account with us from a previous application year, you can use those same credentials. If this is your first time applying or you want to make a new account, you can hit create new account and put in your congregation's information as well as your own contact information so that you can set that up. Next slide. Once you get to the home page after creating an account or logging in, there will be a box that says National Fund for Sacred Places 2024. And this blue button on the right-hand corner of that box that says apply, you'll want to click that. Next slide. And once you click that button, you will be taken to the LOI. You'll be able to see all of the different questions and all of the different sections of the LOI. And I just wanted to draw your attention to two different links on this page. So the first at the top in blue is the collaborate button. You'll be able to add collaborators. They can log in and edit the LOI themselves and help answer any questions that you want to work on as a team. And at the bottom, I highlighted this gray box that says question list. So when you click that, it'll download a PDF of the entire LOI and all of the different questions. And I find this is a really helpful option if you have a large team you'd like to share all the questions with and just start that brainstorming process. You know, what is our approach? What story do we want to tell? The question list can help you circulate that to a lot of different people. All right, next slide. And once you've completed every single question and uploaded all of your attachments, you can submit the LOI. There is a blue button at the bottom of that page that says Submit LOI. You'll want to press that and really make sure that you do submit it. If you don't, the draft will be abandoned basically, and we won't be able to consider it. So make sure you submit it. And once you press this button, you will receive a notification via email that it's been submitted. So if you have not received that email, but you know you did submit it, that's a good time to reach out to us. We can do some troubleshooting and provide technical assistance to make sure that everything got submitted on time. And throughout that process, if you want to save your progress on the LOI, there is a gray button right next to the submit button that says Save LOI. Make sure you hit that. It'll save your progress as you go. All right, next slide. I believe that is it for my section, and we can move on to the Q&A.
Yes, yep. So we have about 10 minutes now for Q&A. Jennifer is going to be monitoring the Q&A section and reading me questions to answer.
Great. Well, thank you all for the great questions. We are trying to respond to many of them, and we'll try to get to them here now. But as Rachel said, our contact information will be listed at the end of this presentation, so you can always reach out to us that way as well. We're getting a lot of questions about the planning grant and whether it can be used to support a conditions assessment. So do you just want to touch again on that, Rachel? Can the planning grant be used to support a conditions assessment?
Yes, yes. The planning grant can be used to fund a conditions assessment or other planning work related to the fundraising or marketing. So big resounding yes on that one. And I'll also say, if we accept a congregation into the program that has not yet done a conditions assessment, it is very likely that we're going to strongly encourage them to do so, and the planning grant will be earmarked for that purpose.
Great. So some questions we're getting around scope, a lot of questions about what specific types of projects that we fund. Do we fund stained glass repair? Do we fund HVAC, electrical, ADA, including some potential new construction that might need to happen to support accessibility? So I'll just say before Rachel responds to that, we really do encourage you to visit the program website, fundforsacredplaces.org, because we have actually information about all of the grantees that have gone through the program already, including the type of work that the program has helped to support. So you can look, there's a map, you can sort of look maybe according to your faith tradition or your geographic area and see what other projects we've funded. But just, do you want to talk a little bit, Rachel, about scope and sort of reiterate how we view that?
Yeah, we do try to keep it general when we discuss what we fund. That's why we have that 3-bucket system. We fund projects related to urgent repair needs at the envelope, ADA, and projects that make space that is underutilized or vacant usable. Every single one of the examples you gave, Jennifer, are eligible. We do stained glass, window repair, we do HVAC. Of course, sometimes a bit of new construction is involved with an ADA project. Usually that's fine too. But to piggyback off of what you said, Jennifer, I encourage everybody to take a look at our website and the participant profiles where we highlight exactly what we funded in over 100 cases.
Yeah, great. And someone asked specifically about fire suppression, and that is something we've funded. So take a look at our website to see that. There's a question I think is important to focus on here about the need for an architect for scopes of work that might be something like HVAC or electrical. Why would someone need an architect if their scope involved those types of projects? So Rachel, or maybe Anne, I don't know if you want to speak to that. Anne?
And I want to ask Ann to take that one.
Okay, so on case-by-case bases, I don't know what the plural of that is, but there are some circumstances where an architect is not required. However, in general, we will always encourage that you get an architect involved, even if it's an electrical or an HVAC issue, specifically because the architect is able to tie all of the subcontractor work together. So a building conditions assessment, right, is ultimately what's going to be driving that. And the architect will be able to have an idea of how your project approach affects your building holistically. So while you may be dealing with an electrical or HVAC system in isolation and you only hire a contractor that knows how to deal with that, there may be other issues related to your building that project scope generates that an architect would be able to think about holistically that a contractor may not. So I hope that answers the question.
Great, thanks. I see a few folks have their hands raised. We are just doing responses in the chat, the Q&A. So please, in the Q&A, not the chat, please put any questions that you may have. There's some questions around when is the right time to apply and thinking about crafting a scope if people are early in their architectural planning phase. Maybe they don't understand, the cost of the project because they still have to go through some discussions with the congregation. So can you just talk a little bit about where people tend to be in their planning process when they apply?
Yeah. Congregations that submit LOIs are at all different stages of planning. Some have a conditions assessment and have from that developed a really clear, specific scope of work that isn't fully priced out, but perhaps there's an estimate. Others do not have a conditions assessment, but know that they need to have one. They know that they need to take that step to advance the project. So in summary, there is no like perfect place to be. It's just really important that you understand how our program works, what we expect in terms of process, and you're willing to work through that process. You're willing to have the conditions assessment done, craft a scope of work that really reflects your building's true priorities, and so on. So we're cool with it all. We just want to make sure everybody's fully informed when they come in.
Yeah, and just to tag onto that as well, some of the questions have been from people who are basically ready to start construction on their project, or maybe they've already started a capital campaign. That can be tougher for our program because we bring you into the program, as we've discussed in October, and then you have some milestones to meet, including raising new matching funds before you can proceed with construction. So if you're essentially ready to go with your construction, it may not be the best fit for you. Okay, 2 minutes left. People are asking about the match. Can you talk again through the 1-to-1 versus the 2-to-1 match and when people can begin raising money in order for qualifying for the match?
Sure. Because we want our grant to be catalytic, funds raised before program entry cannot count toward match. The date that you can start raising matching funds, it's the day that we issue the press release and make the public announcement. So that's why it can't be more specific with this actual date because we haven't figured out exactly when that will be. We have a week targeted, not a day honed in on. So the start date of the program when you can start raising matching funds again is the day that we issue the press release. In terms of how the match works, we require 1-to-1 for grants of $175,000 or less, and 2-to-1 for grants exceeding $175,000 all the way up to $500,000. And I'll use a different example than the one I gave before. If you apply for a grant of $175,000 and get that, you are required to raise $175,000 in match in order to access 100% of the capital grant. That's a 1-to-1 grant. If we were to give the congregation $250,000, they would be required to raise $500,000 as their match. Third example, if you were the super lucky congregation that received a $500,000 grant, you would need to raise 1 million in matching funds.
Yeah.
Hopefully that covers that.
Okay, we're at time.
All right. We are at 1 o'clock, so I want to just thank everybody so much for joining us today. I apologize if we didn't get to your question. I hope we did, but if not, like I said, please reach out. Here's our contact information up on the screen. Have a great day. Thanks.